Dave on the board. We're in transition a little bit this morning because David has been in Minnesota and has just come back, and Bill Saylor has been holding fort and experimenting a little bit with drawings and things like that. I have to thank the Shamrocks for being their 4-H group that came out to Seymour and was working with. It's on. So we pick seed and detasseled reed canary grass, which is one way of preventing it from spreading. I listened to the National Public Radio talking about bear's knees and the things that we'll lose when it is utilized. There was a nice National Public Radio session on that, and a lot of archaeology, not a lot of minerals underneath except coal, but there will be a bun rush for utilizing that site. Susan Taylor gave me a copy of the Wildlife magazine, and in it there's an article that deals with the potholes of North Dakota, South Dakota, into Nebraska, into Canada. It's a remnant of glaciation, and it has thousands of potholes that are the breeding ground or feeding ground or rest over ground for birds and wildlife generally. And as the nation has gone into whiz-bang regarding corn and soybeans, there has been a rush to utilize this ground to drain it and to plant it to corn and soybeans. And that is taking out thousands of acres of wildlife habitat, which is really essential to keeping world biodiversity together. Let me ask David to say something about his trip to Minnesota, and his mother has had eye cataract, and perhaps you could say something about the value of this operation, which seems to be very, very successful.
Ridiculously successful. In and out of the operating room in 45 minutes, and she now sees better than I do. I never knew what cataracts were. It always seemed like something, do they have to take something out of the inside of your eye? All it means is that the lens of your eye has gotten cloudy. And the same companies that make contact lenses to put over to correct your vision make replacement lenses. And so they put them in and fix your eyesight as well. So she now has practically 20/20 vision in that eye. And immediately within the next week took her driver's test because it was time for her next driver's license, and passed it with one 20/20 vision eye. So I had a great time up there. The weather was beautiful. One of my favorite things about it, I love to take the train, and the train that gets you from Chicago, it goes all the way to Portland and Seattle. It's called the Empire Builder, and it goes up through Wisconsin. So you go from Chicago to Minnesota. Try it again to
Wisconsin.
Yeah, Milwaukee, and then you just hit all the little towns up there, LaCroix and the Wisconsin Dells and a bunch of others, and then turn and go west across the Mississippi into Minnesota. And every time you just look out the window on the trip up, I saw lots of deer. They just kind of stand and watch as the train goes by, munching on whatever the leaves are that they're eating. And on the way back, I saw some wild turkey in a clearing of a forest. And then a little bit later that afternoon, I swear it was a residential area, houses up a hill from the train tracks. There was one yard, nicely trimmed, all the grass was mown and everything. There were 5 wild turkeys just in that yard, not to the left, not to the house on the right, just in this one person's backyard. So it's really great to just see wildlife. Well, I did not see a lot of what I could recognize as prairie plants. There were black-eyed Susan everywhere. In fact, there was some places where people had obviously been planting them. They look like this isn't prairie black-eyed Susan. This is a monitored. They've actually been putting these black-eyed Susan there.
The black-eyed Susans grow very well, and they're easy to establish, and they're respectable as far as people who are used to horticultural gardens. It's a little bit of a transition between the horticultural garden and wildlife.
It's sort of a compromise, isn't it? It's a wild plant, but it's cultivated.
The composites generally grow very well. The sunflower family.
Yeah, it's an aster. It's in the aster family.
Yes, the asters are now coming in, and they will flower through November and give some color to the prairie. So you mentioned driver's licenses. I had to do the same. And I want to say that I have a real respect for what the driver's license people do. I sort of had treated it rather casually. I went to register a vehicle, and I knew my license examination was coming due, and there weren't very many people, so I just said, "Oh, I'll do that too." But I hadn't read the guidebook. I wasn't up to date on specific things, and so I had to go back a second time. And it's very difficult to assess someone who's getting older. You need to have people who are able to drive sensibly on the road. That means you have to not be too slow and not be too fast, and you have to obey new regulations that involve bicycle ways. And it's a little bit on the controversial side. It's hard to know what to do with a bicycle and a car when you are both trying to turn right. And so you have to have portions of the bicycle way that are shared. There are things that the License Bureau people can check you out on, and often it's very specific details, and sometimes not so specific. First of all, you have to have equipment that is good. So my van had a little bit of a cackle, and between my first and second check, we went to 4 muffler organizations because we knew what was wrong with it. The manifold has a tiny crack in it. So you don't always recognize the cackle, but people who deal with cars all the time can recognize that. And so I got a lecture about carbon monoxide and that sort of thing. Well, 4 muffler people all deal with the pipe that goes from the manifold back. But the manifold is right close to the engine, and it heats, and it often destroys the bolts that hold the manifold on. And it's very easy to break that bolt when you're undoing it. So then you have to get a drill and drill a hole through the leftover stud, and then use an easy out to get it out. And it was kind of a surprise to me, but the estimate on that is somewhere in the $700 category, mainly because it is so hard to work on manifolds. And if one manifold has a small crack in it, it's likely that another one would have same. So I actually borrowed another car, which was much smaller, and that it was stick shift, so that gave us some indication that I was able to drive not only a regular vehicle but a stick shift, and that turned out okay. And thanks to Al from Piano people who lent me his vehicle, and it's helpful to have a smaller car when you have to back out onto a street and contain your vehicle to one lane, and we can't always do that with a bigger vehicle, especially with trucks. So I have a lot of respect for the License Bureau people. I was there enough to register vehicles and to do tests, and some people know me because of being in the paper recently with regard to the Big Dig. One of the things that I didn't realize was that my particular vehicle starts with a jolt, and that's a no-no. But that has to do with the vehicle and what you get used to, and so you have to make sure your vehicle is in good shape when you go to get a license. This is another one that's kind of interesting. You have to know how to direct your wheels when you stop on a hill. The problem is that Champaign has very few hills, but so it's a sort of nominal thing, but you have to know about that.
For people who haven't had to do that in a long time, it used to be up, and away, meaning you turn the wheel out into, so the front of the car wheels is pointing out into the intersection. But did they change that? You're not actually supposed to do it the other direction?
No, well, I grew up with the mountains, so it was very, very important to turn your wheels so that you didn't go 200 feet down the hill.
Right, but I believe they've changed it. Again, you're supposed to turn your wheels and then move back into...
When you have a curb, you turn your wheels into the road so that your vehicle will back into the into the curb.
Because at one time, at least they were saying, oh no, you know what? We really had to have people point their wheels so the front of the wheels point into the curb. That way, if you do jump the curb, at least your car backs onto the property, not into the street.
Yes.
So it is still up and away.
So then I've been watching the Poorborough's development. The Pocket Prairie has now been brought down by 4 feet and it's been paved in quite an interesting manner. And the little Pocket Prairie that we thought we'd have in perpetuity is now a dogleg. And I've been watching it's a dogleg that meets code so that you have a slope that's reasonable for a wheelchair to get out. And that will be access to that particular bar. And they're getting quite a trade. So, it's utilizing a building that's been empty for many years. So I've been watching the concreting, and it's amazing the expertise that the people come to do specific jobs. I've been watching them put in formwork. It used to be always boards, but now it comes with steel frames that are locked together effectively, and concrete is poured into a certain level to give the slope. And if we do something pictorial, we might just include some of those that information. The Big Dig that has been the result of moving the Pocket Prairie is in action. Joel McDonald and Cole, a helper, came and helped weed and took away the a wetland weed, which is a nut sedge, and took it to the recycling centre for plant material in Urbana. I've had volunteers seeing me work there and stop and say, can we help? And they've helped water, and there's enough of those people that we're hoping to get some of them together to have a little group that will perhaps once a month or something like that take an interest in that particular site. I met up with the forestry department people who are in control of the lawn mowing that's nearby, and we've taken over rather rudely some of the lawn. And there's a need for a recreational field. There's a nice slope down, and we are interrupting that a little bit. And there's a thought that perhaps we should be using some wetland species like ironweed or culver's root, plants that enjoy a slightly more damp site. Carrie Lynn came by, Carrie Ellis Lynn. She knows me from reading the landscape that we taught at Parkland College many years ago. I'm pleased to see that there is now a Master Naturalist as well as a Master Gardener program with the College of Agriculture or NRIS. And but some of this started probably best part of 30 years ago with a course called Reading the Landscape at Parkland, and that was where I first met Carrie. And she's been doing prairie work in Wisconsin and other places, and she may be helpful. Joel McDonald was talking to Dee, and I've forgotten Dee's other name, but she works at a little coffee shop just up the road, and that coffee shop is doing well. And so we move the idea around. She is prepared to weed and pick up junk that might be falling, but it's a nice walkway, and we think that there's a good compromise for moving from the Pocket Prairie on Market Street to 2nd Street, where there are good walkways, and there are nice little prairie elements that are planted 5 years ago, so our stuff will just augment what is already there. And there's a very nice little prairie almost on University Avenue and 2nd Street, near to the Habitat for Humanity. And it was suggested that we might plant plants into that. But I think it's a horticultural prairie with plants that will be flowering from time to time. And there's some spectacular plants, including cardinal plant. There's still a few little pieces of red on the cardinal plant, but it needs water. And it also, that little plot needs to be watched to see that there's enough water coming off the hill. It's not getting the water of the boneyard because the boneyard goes underneath it in concrete pipes at that point. And so the prairie is sitting on top of the concrete pipes and taking water from off the slope nearby. We're looking at downtown development, and generally speaking, a week or so ago, I reported on the Yard, which is a huge area from the MTD building. The Goodyear has retired and gone to another place. Rogards has moved, and just several acres there will, the city hopes, become a site for a hockey arena that will be also big enough for conferences. One of the problems with inviting conference people to this town or any event is that you have to have people in perhaps 5 hotels that are nearby, and that's not ideal. So for a big conference, they would prefer to have a rather large hotel that can be the on-site hotel with a place where you can have 1,000 people in a keynote address situation. So the buildings around about are beginning to empty, so that can happen. Doesn't always happen. I was tempted to say that we need to also think about some of the niches that are around, like the pocket prairie, or like bringing historic trains into town. We have thousands of people sitting around on a Friday night. It's been very, very successful to have music on a Friday night. And I also want to say that we need to think back to the time when Urbana was faced with the fact that there was a railroad through West Urbana, and it became Champaign. And Urbana didn't really move to the railroad line like many communities did. So they were sort of a little bit isolated, mile or two to the east. But they did have the county seat and the county buildings. So Urbana has retained itself and has some particular character to it. I took photographs of the main street. I was looking at the Cohen building, the Knowlton Bennett building, with nice little diagrams and a discussion on a board in a non-invasive way to discuss when and where and why and how these buildings were built. And there are other buildings. There's a retired post office, which is now the Independent Media Center. There's a cinema gallery. And so I poked my nose into the cinema gallery, and there was two people being exhibited at the moment, and kind of interesting. One is Thomas Skaggs, who has been a landscape architect and planner with the university and is retired, but he's a whiz-bang in working with wood and looking at the grain and really being working with it in a kindly, innovative manner. And I think you should see that if you get a chance. It's at the cinema gallery. And there's the other exhibitor at the same time also exhibits with Tom Skaggs. It's Dana Brown, and she does encaustic paintings where you work with wax, and it's a very interesting way of painting. And it's almost like an extension of watercolor, but it's not, and it's to some extent three-dimensional. And she concentrates on railroad yards and physical plant things. And I just like the style. This is not casual art. This is art that has taken years and years to do. And it's people who have a lot of talent to do so. If you look at some of the new things that have happened in Urbana, I look at the Idea Store, which is in the mall. The mall was experimental. When I look at people doing things, you have three main units: the Champaign, Urbana, and the university. And although they're all very different, they come together in an interesting manner. And over the years, they've tried to do some things. If you're entrepreneurial, if you're a planner, not everything worked. So we had a mall in Neal Street for many years, and it took $1 million to put it in, and then it was adjudicated that it should go out because Neal Street is the main drag. and people were having to go around that site, and the mall wasn't working that well. It was open, and it was very cold if you were there on a winter's day, but it was one of these things where you attempt to do things and may not necessarily work, but don't be afraid to do that. And I think the city has been pretty good at experimenting with these sorts of things. Even what is on South First Street is experimental, and people may or may not continue forth. The whole bar trade is experimental. It used to be that the bar group would be contained to 8 or 12 people. Then it was decided, let's go entrepreneur, laissez-faire. If you have a bar and it doesn't work, well, get out of it. It's up to the economics of a real life situation. So it does go on. As distinct from high-end art, the idea store is moving from Champaign to the mall. The mall in Urbana is kind of interesting because it's small. It was one of the earliest ones, and it's smaller than what you would get on the Market Street Mall, where all the businesses have moved for a while, and then are starting to come back to gentrify the what was left of the dead central business district, and now it's very much alive. So this sort of experimentation is good. I want to say that if you were a biologist and you came here, we have no ecosystem left. So then things like the Big Dig become helpful. The Big Dig in itself is an experiment to see that you don't have to have people canoeing and rowing down Green Street and having water in their basements. This is a detention pond, it's probably a retention pond rather than a detention pond. The difference is that one is permanent and makes a lake, and the other one releases the water gently. And so there's a nice little Boneyard Creek being like a river with waterfalls that aerate and goes into a larger pond, and then is allowed to travel out, and then goes mostly through Campus Town in huge walk-through pipes that then emerge in Urbana to become the open boneyard, which has been developed at the Urbana end. Near the Station Theatre, there's places where people can play music, enjoy, and that then goes down to the Salt Fork and to the Vermilion, to the Wabash, to the Ohio, and to the Mississippi, and out into the Gulf. And we have to watch what's going on there. If you look at the Big Dig or the detention pond at the moment, there's quite a lot of green algae, and it's probably more than that. It may be little green plants. We talked a little bit last week about hyacinths, and other plants can get there. And part of it is because there's enough leftover, washed out phosphate and nitrates to allow that growth. If that continues to be too excessive, the extra chemicals, including the herbicides and pesticides, go down the Mississippi and cause a dead zone in the Gulf, and we need to watch that. So I was tempted to say that the name given to some of this development, which is huge and a very good presentation 2 weeks ago, and then immediately after that, the people went off to Washington to see if they could raise money to do a multi-million-dollar event, and it's been named the Yard, and I think that's probably because there was a scrapyard there. But the Yard, in my estimate, is the railroad yards north of Bradley. So this is kind of a misnomer. So I say that. I don't know whether it will change once things get named. It's very hard to change the name. But I also said things about long-term involvement and experimentation, and it's a little hard to stand in front of a city board and say things and remember what you want to say, even if you rehearsed yourself a little beforehand. So then one of the things that's kind to do is to take your idea to the planners or to the people behind the scenes so that you can talk in a little more relaxed manner. The last Tuesday night was mainly tourism. The Convention and Visitor Bureau has been renamed to the Visitor Champaign. It's VCC. It's more or less a visitor center, and it speaks for the community generally, the Champaign, the middle town between Champaign and Campus Town, the university, Urbana, Savoy, and then moves out to cooperative ventures with Rantoul and St. Joe, and then it goes even further to places like Arcola or to Tolono, Tuscola, and to Mahomet, and I like that idea of more regional planning, and I encourage that. But the tourism presentation was very good. People who know what they're doing with trying to elicit events, and I applaud what they were doing there. I felt like my small contribution was rather rough and tough, but we need people to come who are not necessarily specialists, who have the get up and go to say a few words, even though it might be disconvolulated, and you get the message across. We want historic buildings. For instance, on Market Street, we take out the quality of the Market Street? It was kind of a raunchy street in its day, but the old Willie's Night garage is now going to be a bar, and they've kept the quality of the building and changed the interior some, but it's done very professionally. There are a couple more buildings that have been vacated by the News Gazette, which I hope might stay and continue their ambiance of a little history. That's why I went over to Urbana and looked at the various buildings there. And there are also little things that you like to see around. One of them is second-hand shops. It used to be, when Champaign was more a dead central business district, a place where you had second-hand shops right in downtown. Now the second-hand shops tend to be, one that I go to regularly is in Savoy, and one is out on Marketplace, not quite downtown. So what do you do downtown? What buildings do you encourage? Is there hardware? Is there special places like the piano people had to move in order to allow for cars, parking garage. They went to an interesting place, but it was West Champaign, and it's in consideration at the moment because Steve, the guy that owned the piano movers, has passed, and that causes a concern. Carl Clinic was thinking to buy it perhaps because they need to have ambulances closer to people in the west side of Champaign. But that has come to a halt at the moment. But so what sort of things do you need downtown? We are finding out that pollution is not very good for people who live in a concentrated area where there are lots of cars and trucks. So do we design a city for bicycles? Where do you get the bicycles? Lately, on Market Street, there have been blue bicycles or green bicycles, I forget which, but you can pick up and use and drop somewhere else. And so that's an innovation. You can rent cars instead of having a car that you bring yourself. And how do we work with that internationally? How do we go to Mexico City and the doctors have been there assessing the microparticles that are in the air, and what is the well health of people who have to live with that? It gets into your lungs and into your nasal passageways, and it reduces the value of your life, and it can take you into an Alzheimer's situation prematurely. And so it's getting to be realized that we should design our cities for less of that sort of pollution, whether it be factories or whether it be vehicles. Sometimes people have, especially in Cold War area, cold time, or in summertime, they leave their diesel trucks running, and what comes out of a diesel engine is not awfully good for your health. So how do we design our cities to be more open for walking, biking, and perhaps not so many people in one unit that they don't have a little part of town where they meet, a Greenwich Village perhaps. How do we deal with high-rise apartments and how people live? Do they live more independently but also more privately so that they have facilities on site but they don't necessarily meet so many people? What do we do about small pocket prairies or west side parks? There should be niches here and there. We are trying to get historic trains into Champaign from the Monticello Railroad Museum. Where would it come with? And so I encourage you to walk around your towns and cities and even your rural places to see what is interesting, what can you do cooperatively without breathing down some people's necks because they might have interesting landscape that you could also utilize. So how do you get that sort of cooperation together? It means a lot of people have to be interested, and sometimes that hasn't happened. That there's a shortage of leadership often second-level leadership. There's usually a leader of the push that moves and shakes. That might be a group of 5 people, coffee in the basement, and do it. But when it comes to doing something like a Kickapoo Trail, you need hundreds of people interested, but you also need 4 or 5 people who can lead and suggest venues. There's one coming up in November, I think 16th perhaps, at Sleepy Village. It's at Oakwood, and that will be a fundraiser, but it needs someone who is in a forest preserve or a Vermilion County Conservation District to be able to get that into action, work with private people who are interested in promoting the Kickapoo Trail. And we have a lot of that, but we probably need more than we have at the moment. That also goes for Heartland Pathways. Heartland Pathways has been in that phase where you do and hope, and that then as you age you need to have that sort of facility move over into a more regular paradigm, and we lack that some, and we don't exactly know how to solve the problem. It's not a crime to not know where you're going. It's not a crime to try to do things. So at the moment I'm trying to work with people who may be federal, maybe state, maybe regional, maybe city, maybe individuals who have foundations or not-for-profit agencies that know how to take the resources and develop them. So I have a letter on hand from the Bruce Hannon's Conservation Foundation, and there's a thought that they might take over some of our efforts over the years and continue them. You have to decide whether foundations want to cherry pick a little bit and take the better parts, whereas there are parts that are not quite so well looking like potential multi-million-dollar corridors, but they're there. I'm thinking especially of the area between White Heath and Clinton. It goes from White Heath to Shady Rest, to where you cross over the Sangamon River, up to Lodge, and then to DeLand and Weldon and Lane. And then there's another river system called the Salt Fork Creek, and there's a Hensley Moraine there. And 5 miles of that bed can connect Clinton Power Plant Lake, which is supervised by the State Department of Natural Resources, and then into Clinton and Weldon State Park, which is has a little bit of artesian water that is Weldon Springs. And so how do we work with that and have a future which is somewhat permanent? How do you establish the rules of the game? And how do you do that in perpetuity, and how do you deal with the adjacent owners, some of which, or a lot of which, are farmers, and this extra 100 feet of land could be extra rows of corn and soybeans, and more income for farmers that often have a hard time surviving. So you have to find those people who also who also do know that you need the genetic material that is on this bed on either side of the ballast. So you don't know what biochemical you may need in 200 years' time for a disease that you don't know about yet. And if you've gotten rid of all your biodiversity, then you have Buckley's chance of finding out the biochemical you could extract, and then could create like estrogen or something like that artificially, and you don't have to even go back to nature, but you might have a crop that produces something. There's the cannabis relatives are good at providing rope, and so how can we work with the debate about drugs and the useful other parts of the plant? There are plants that might actually reduce erosion. If you have to plant soybeans every year, they're a mongrel as far as eroding soil. So you have to disturb it every year. It's much better to have a plant that is going to be perennial. And most of our prairie is perennial. And how can you then find a plant that is like glycine, which is soybeans, and look at it for 50 years with probably 50 scientists or agronomists who can look at the seed. It's a bundle weed we're looking at the moment, and that seed is not easy to harvest. How do you increase the crop, the volume, the weight of the product? Will it be nutritious? If it's nutritious, is there an element in it that makes it taste strange? Are you adapting it for ethanol to put it to save digging coal and petroleum? What are the bacteria on its roots, the rhizobacteria that help to take in nitrogen and convert it to a form that improves the organic matter in the soil that we're taking advantage of, because for 10,000 years you've had those sort of plants that improve the soil, and so we need people that do things like the master naturalist, and David is doing the master naturalist, and he has found it a fun thing to do, and he might just say something about the master naturalists and how many people are there and how they're interacting.
Sure. If you watch WILL TV, about once a month they'll have a TV show where they actually have local gardeners talking about local gardening issues. I'm confident some or all of those people that you see on the show have gone through the Master Gardener program, which is actually put together by the U of I Extension. And basically, as I understand it, you have 11 weeks of classes, about 8 hours each class period, where you learn different aspects of cultivated plants. I have no idea what you talk about for 88 hours, but that's what you do. And so they've got the comparable natural version of it. The difference being I'm sure gardening has to go beyond just plants. You must talk about insects and insecticides and fertilizers and all that sort of stuff. But in the nature one, nature is all the rest of the world that people haven't planned. So we have good grief. We just had insects. We have just talked about flowing water. What is in flowing water? The animals that you find in flowing water, like fish and things like that. And let's see, I can't even tell you what we have coming up, but eventually we'll get to geology. How did the planet get here? Why is it that you've got 14 different ecologies, biozones, whatever, in the state of Illinois? Because over the course of a couple of glaciations, you've got all these different kinds of areas, places that have never been touched by glaciers versus ones that have been mowed down and are very, very flat. Where would that be? And yes, I'm just having the best time. Did you know that there are only 3 types of insects that only have 2 wings? And I can only remember 2 of them. Mosquitoes and flies are 2 of the 3 groups. All the rest of the kinds of insects that you see may look like they've only got 2, but it's because their pair of wings are kind of folded over each other. So I've learned at least one thing in 7 weeks now of 8-hour days of classes. And yes, we've got quite a few classes left to go. And weather, there's going to be one whole class period on weather. I'm really interested to see what we're going to talk about for that.
And yes, in here also is genomes. So what can you do with a plant if it has a flavor that is not ideal? Can you infuse a gene that would change that? And that's tremendously controversial, because if you could do that to a plant, you can do that to a pig, you can do that to a human, and it's a perpetual debate.
Douglas Adams was a very clever science fiction writer. He wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and he considered the problem that people say you shouldn't eat meat because you're killing an animal. It wasn't its choice that it's being ate. So Douglas Adams said, okay, let's evolve, in this case, a pig that's sentient and wants to be ate. And so actually at this restaurant, they wheel the pig out and it points to different parts of itself and says, this should be very tasty. I've gotten very plump here. So wouldn't that solve the problem of vegetarians not wanting to eat something that didn't chew? What if the animal wants to be eaten? So there you go. There's how to make a genetic change in something.
So that requires people who have a lot of expertise. Do we put them on a pedestal? Or do we ask them to tell us roughly what they're doing and why and how? And so then it requires at the other end people who, like ourselves, are fairly ignorant of the biochemical pathways or the physical presence of arsenic or heavy metals or things that might hurt us when we don't know. How do we get those people together? And so in order to do that, you have to have community efforts that are like the Extension Service, where they go out and this Master Gardener and Master Naturalist event is in other states and other countries. And some of the things that people like Jack White, who have put together the 14 ecosystems that you were speaking about, have created a system with many people involved, not just one person, to create regions so that you know whether this particular region is on a sandy soil and it has certain characteristics. It might be at Beardstown, where it's near to the Mississippi River. What are flatlands? Are there forests that are in the south, like bull cypress? When at the other end, you are looking at almost Arctic vegetation. So then you have people like Jeffords and Post that put together books that you can really read and have fun with, and they cover these regions, and let you know. And Susan Post has got a book that directs you to these places. So there's a map. And sometimes we've been very reserved about creating maps, because if you have a map, then everyone can go to the place. And I can think of one plant where we had 10 purple gentians, and suddenly we had less of that. And that you have to know that somebody is going to try to plant that plant. They have enough knowledge to know that they can probably do it, but the plant doesn't like that. It's not that the person who's doing the transfer doesn't know the requirements of that particular plant, and so then we lose that plant. Okay, 2 minutes. The nth degree of this is to go to the prairies in Minnesota and the Dakotas, and where the agriculture is suddenly taking out some of the only prairie we have left. And so you can see these in the picture that we probably will put up. You can see lines of agriculture taking over the potted areas where there's just a rich retinue of biodiversity. And so travel also helps. So ecotourism has come up. And so if you want to go to a site, you can usually find out that you can go and not only be at the site, but you learn about the site by working with the site, and you provide your rather essential volunteer work. And we need that here. We have a county that is down to 0.01% of the prairie having been saved and by the state. There are little pieces of prairie here, there, and everywhere, so we haven't lost it out altogether. But we have 3 significant cemeteries, and if you had 10,000 acres here, in enough different habitats, you may have 110 prairie broadleaves plus about 6 grasses. One of these cemeteries has 80 species. And there was a real effort to put an area around, a protective area around it, but it was planted to fairly aggressive prairie plants like the grasses, and they started to invade the cemetery, and then our own prairie plants can take out the biodiversity that you want. So then there has to be a change, and some of this goes back to being game enough to experiment, like we brought in Russian olives or autumn olives that have nice little fruiting bodies that birds can eat, but they also spread them around, so now we have a weed. Okay, this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 FM.
And Dave on the board. It's now 12 o'clock. That means it's time for Shruti, Music of India. Oh, yes, and as always, the views and opinions expressed here are solely those of the speakers.